I was driving back to my childhood home, a trip I had been putting off for months. Years of resenting my father based entirely on what my mother and stepfather had told me weighed heavily on my mind. Then came that day when everything I believed was shattered by an accidental revelation. Now, as I approached the house where my mother was supposedly having an emotional breakdown, I wondered if I could face the woman who had orchestrated the greatest betrayal of my life. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. If this resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe to join others who have faced family betrayals like mine. My earliest memories of my father, back when I was around 6 years old, were filled with warmth and security. Hector Williams was not a perfect man, but he tried his best. He worked long hours as a construction foreman to provide for our family, often coming home with sawdust still clinging to his flannel shirts and work boots. Despite his exhaustion, he always made time for me. Every Saturday morning, regardless of the weather, he would wake me up at dawn for our fishing trips to Lake Carson. We would sit side by side on the weathered dock, our lines cast into the still water as the sun rose over the pine trees. He taught me patience, showing me how to wait for the perfect moment before reeling in. "Life is about timing, son," he would say in his deep, steady voice. "Rush things and you will always come up empty." In his workshop behind our modest ranch home, he taught me how to build birdhouses and simple wooden toys. I can still remember the pride in his eyes when I hammered my first nail straight through without bending it. Those calloused hands that guided mine were gentle despite their strength. My mother Diane seemed content with our middle-class life at first. She kept our home immaculate, volunteered at my school, and prepared home-cooked meals that brought us together each evening. But something changed during my 8th year. That was when Jackson Turner entered our lives. He was my father's best friend from college days, the best man at their wedding, and my godfather. Unlike my father, who had built his construction business from scratch, Jackson had inherited his real estate development company from his family. He drove a sleek black Mercedes, wore tailored suits, and always brought expensive gifts when he visited. "Your Uncle Jackson sure knows how to live, does not he?" my mother would comment, a strange tone in her voice that I could not identify then. Looking back, I now recognize it as envy. I began noticing subtle shifts in our family dynamic. My mother spent more time getting ready whenever Jackson came over for dinner. She laughed louder at his jokes and leaned in when he spoke about his travels to New York and Paris. Her eyes would sparkle when he described the penthouses and vacation homes he helped wealthy clients purchase. Meanwhile, my father remained oblivious, genuinely happy to see his old friend succeeding. "Jackson always had the golden touch," he would say proudly, without a trace of jealousy. Jackson started visiting more frequently, especially on evenings when my father worked late overseeing construction projects. He would bring takeout from expensive restaurants, foods, with names I could not pronounce. My mother would send me to bed early on these nights, but I would sneak halfway down the stairs to watch them talking closely on the couch, wine glasses in hand. The first real argument between my parents that I remember happened after one of these visits. I pressed my ear against my bedroom door, heart racing as their voices carried down the hallway. "You seem to light up whenever Jackson is around," my father said, his voice strained. "Is there something I should know, Diane?" "Do not be ridiculous," my mother snapped. "Maybe I just enjoy adult conversation that does not revolve around concrete and lumber for once." The arguments became more frequent, with my father becoming increasingly confused and desperate. "Tell me what you want, and I will try to give it to you," he begged one night. "Some things cannot be fixed with trying harder, Hector," she replied coldly. I watched my once confident father become uncertain, checking his phone constantly, coming home earlier from work bringing flowers that ended up discarded in the trash. Meanwhile, my mother grew more distant, spending hours on phone calls that ended abruptly when anyone entered the room. The night everything fell apart remains burned into my memory. I was 10 years old, already in bed, but still awake, clutching my baseball mitt that my father had helped me break in. The front door opened, and I heard my father's tired greeting. Instead of the usual silence or curt response, my mother's voice rang out clearly, "We need to talk. I want a divorce." The silence that followed felt endless. Then came the sound of something dropping my father's lunchbox hitting the tile floor. "What are you talking about?" His voice cracked. "Diane, we can work through this. Whatever it is, there is nothing to work through. I have made my decision." I crept to the top of the stairs, peering through the banister rails. My father stood frozen in the entryway, still in his work clothes, while my mother sat perfectly composed on the couch. "Is there someone else?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Before she could answer, the doorbell rang. I watched in confusion as my mother opened the door to reveal Jackson standing there, his expression serious. "What is he doing here?" my father asked, bewilderment turning to anger. "I called him," my mother said. "I do not feel safe having this conversation alone with you." My father's face contorted with confusion. "Not safe? When have I ever?" "Do not pretend, Hector," she interrupted sharply. "Jackson knows how you get when you are angry." The accusation hung in the air. I had never seen my father violent, yet my mother spoke as if it were an established fact. Jackson stepped between them, placing a hand on my father's shoulder. "Buddy, why do not you calm down before you do something you will regret?" My father shrugged off the hand. "Do not touch me. What is going on here?" The argument escalated, voices rising. When my father moved toward my mother, Jackson immediately pulled out his phone. "I am calling the police if you take another step." Police. For what my father looked genuinely baffled. 20 minutes later, 2 officers were leading my father out of our home, despite his protests that he had done nothing wrong. I watched from my window, tears streaming down my face as the patrol car lights flashed blue and red across our front lawn. That was the first night I felt afraid of my father. In the weeks that followed, my mother and Jackson worked together to construct an elaborate narrative about who my father truly was. They never sat me down for a formal conversation. Instead, they planted seeds of doubt and fear through seemingly casual remarks. "Your father has always struggled with his temper," my mother would say while preparing dinner, as if commenting on the weather. "That is why I could never leave dirty dishes in the sink." Remember how he would yell about the house being messy? I did remember my father occasionally asking us to pick up after ourselves, but in my new framework of understanding, these ordinary parental requests transformed into evidence of a controlling nature. Jackson would chime in with his own carefully crafted anecdotes. "Your dad nearly punched a subcontractor once over a missed deadline," he told me, while helping with homework. "I had to pull him back. That is just how he is, buddy. Not his fault some men just cannot handle pressure." I had no reason to doubt these stories. Why would my mother and godfather lie? They described incidents of my father losing control during times I was asleep or away at school. They mentioned protecting me from witnessing the worst of his behavior. Most damaging was my mother's tearful confession one night about how my father had supposedly grabbed her arm during an argument, leaving bruises she had carefully hidden. "I never wanted you to know," she whispered, showing me faint marks on her upper arm. I was so ashamed. At 10 years old, I lacked the perspective to question whether those bruises might have come from elsewhere or existed at all. I only knew my mother was crying and someone had hurt her. The villain in this story had been established, my father. By the time the divorce was finalized, I had fully absorbed the fabricated history. When my father tried to hug me during court-mandated visitations, I would stiffen, wondering if the same hands that built birdhouses with me had been raised against my mother. The genuine confusion and hurt in his eyes only confirmed what Jackson had told me: "Your dad is good at hiding his true nature when he wants something." 6 months after the divorce was finalized, my mother married Jackson in a lavish ceremony at the Grand Terrace Hotel. I served as ring bearer, walking down the aisle in a miniature tuxedo that matched Jackson's, a detail my mother had insisted upon for the photographs. Within weeks, we moved from our modest ranch home to Jackson's 5-bedroom colonial in Oakwood Estates, the most prestigious neighborhood in town. My new bedroom was twice the size of my old one, with a flat-screen television mounted on the wall and a view of the swimming pool in the backyard. Material comforts replaced emotional stability as my mother and Jackson established our new normal. "This is the life we deserve," my mother told me, showing me around our new home. No more penny pinching, no more stress about bills. Jackson enrolled me in private school, bought me designer clothes, and took us on extravagant vacations to Disney World and the Bahamas. Each luxury came with subtle reminders of what we had escaped. "Imagine if we were still stuck in that tiny house," my mother would say, while lounging by the pool. Or Jackson would comment, "Niece, not having to walk on eggshells in your own home is not its sport." The most insidious aspect of this new arrangement was how Jackson positioned himself as my father figure. "You can call me Dad if you want," he suggested casually one evening, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Totally up to you, but I want you to know I consider you my son now." My mother enthusiastically encouraged this transition, correcting me when I referred to Jackson instead of your dad in conversation. Photos of my biological father disappeared from our new home, replaced by professionally shot family portraits featuring the three of us, a perfect new family with no visible cracks. Despite the custody arrangement granting him weekend visitations, my father never missed a scheduled time with me. He would arrive precisely at the agreed hour, parking his aging pickup truck a respectful distance from Jackson's circular driveway. I would watch from my window as he straightened his shirt, checked his reflection in the side mirror, and walked with determined steps to the front door. Jackson would answer their exchanged words, too distant for me to hear, but their body language told the story. Jackson, tall and confident in the doorway of his mansion. My father, standing slightly hunched, an outsider on the periphery of my new life. During these visits, my father would take me fishing, to baseball games, or simply to the park. He always brought thoughtful gifts, a hand-carved chess set. When I mentioned an interest in the game, a telescope when I talked about astronomy books, about subjects I had casually mentioned weeks earlier. These gestures, which should have touched me instead, made me uncomfortable evidence, I thought, of his desperation to win me over. "Your father will say or do anything to make himself look good," my mother had warned. "Do not fall for it." So I received his gifts with cool politeness, answered his questions with minimal detail, and maintained emotional distance throughout our time together. I can still picture him driving me home after one particularly silent afternoon, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he struggled to find conversation topics I would engage with. "I miss you, son," he finally said, his voice breaking slightly. "I know things are complicated right now, but I hope someday you will understand." "I understand plenty," I interrupted, parroting my mother's words. "You cannot control your anger, and that is why Mom left." The shock and pain that flashed across his face should have given me pause, but instead it confirmed the narrative I had been fed. He was upset at being exposed, not at the unfairness of the accusation. At a custody exchange, when I was 12, I refused to even speak to him. As Jackson and my mother watched from the doorway, my father knelt to my eye level in the driveway. "I love you," he said simply. "No matter what, that will never change." I walked past him without a word, each step encouraged by my mother's approving smile. By high school, my resentment toward my father had calcified into a central part of my identity. When teachers asked about family problems to explain my occasional outbursts in class, I readily offered my father's abusive nature as explanation. Each telling reinforced the narrative, adding embellishments that even my mother had not suggested. "My dad has serious anger issues," I told my first girlfriend when explaining why I never invited her to meet him. "He cannot control himself. That is why I have trouble talking about feelings sometimes." This narrative served multiple purposes. It excused my own behavioral problems, garnered sympathy from peers and adults, and reinforced my bond with my mother and Jackson, who encouraged this perspective through subtle validation. "It makes sense. You struggle with your temper sometimes," Jackson would say, after I got detention for shouting at a teacher. "You know what they say about apples and trees." Meanwhile, my father continued his quiet persistence. Though I rarely acknowledged his presence, he attended every baseball game, sitting far enough away that I could pretend not to see him. He sent birthday cards with heartfelt messages I barely skimmed. When I received academic awards, I would occasionally spot him in the back of the auditorium slipping out before the reception so as not to cause a scene. During my junior year, My father showed up at an important baseball championship wearing a pressed button-down shirt instead of his usual work clothes. I remember feeling embarrassed by his earnest attempts to fit in among the wealthy parents from my private school, most of whom arrived in luxury vehicles and designer clothes. When Jackson loudly offered to take the team for pizza afterward, making sure everyone knew he was covering the bill, I pretended not to notice my father quietly leaving the stands. With Jackson covering all expenses, I attended Westmore University, an exclusive private college 3 states away. The distance provided perfect justification for cutting contact with my father almost entirely. Our interaction dwindled to brief phone calls on holidays and birthdays, conversations so stilted and formal they barely qualified as communication. "How are your classes?" he would ask. "Fine," I would reply. "Do you need anything?" "No, Jackson takes care of everything." The pause that followed always stretched uncomfortably long, as if he was swallowing words he knew I did not want to hear. During those college years, my father sent letters that arrived like clockwork at the beginning of each month. Most remained unopened in my desk drawer, or were skimmed quickly and discarded. They contained updates about his life. His small construction company was slowly rebuilding. He had moved to a new apartment closer to town. He had adopted a rescue dog named Bernie. Occasionally, he would mention news articles or books that reminded him of my interests, proving he still remembered details about me despite our estrangement. I fashioned myself after Jackson during this period, dressing in expensive clothes, joining the right fraternity, and cultivating the polished image of someone born into privilege, rather than someone whose access to it came through his priest mother's second marriage. When friends asked about my family, I spoke exclusively of Jackson's real estate empire and my mother's charity work as if my biological father had never existed. At 25, with a business degree and job offers from several prestigious firms, I made an unexpected trip home during Memorial Day weekend. Having forgotten my house key, I entered through the unlocked back door, intending to surprise my mother and Jackson. Their voices drifted from Jackson's home office, the door slightly ajar, allowing slivers of afternoon sunlight to escape into the hallway. Something in their tone made me pause rather than announce my presence. "Can you believe it has been 15 years since we pulled it off?" Jackson's voice carried a smug satisfaction I had never heard before. "Best investment I ever made." My mother's laughter followed, light conspiratorial. "Hector never saw it coming, did he? So trusting, so naive." The mention of my father's name froze me in place. I inched closer to the door, barely breathing. "Remember when we convinced the judge he was unstable?" Jackson continued. "Those fake bruises were a stroke of genius, Diane." "Makeup artist training finally came in handy," my mother replied, her voice carrying a disturbing pride, though the real masterpiece was turning his own son against him. My stomach twisted as I struggled to process what I was hearing. "To Hector Williams," Jackson said, followed by the clink of glasses. "The man who unwittingly gave me his wife, his son, and eventually his business. The construction clients practically fell into your lap once those rumors about his temper spread through town," my mother added. "He never raised a hand to you, did he?" Jackson asked, sounding amused rather than concerned. "Not once," my mother confirmed casually, though he was painfully boring. All work and family, family and work. No ambition beyond his little construction company. "And now look at Turner Development Properties," Jackson boasted. 3 states and expanding. All because we convinced everyone that Hector Williams was an abusive husband who could not be trusted in business. The look on his face in court when I testified about feeling unsafe. My mother's voice trailed off in reminiscent laughter. "And the kid bought it completely," Jackson added. "Best insurance policy we could have had." Once Hector Jr. believed his father was a monster, there was no coming back from that. The floor seemed to shift beneath my feet. Every memory of my childhood suddenly required re-examination, the stories, the warnings, the subtle manipulations. My throat closed as bile rose, the physical manifestation of 15 years of lies unraveling in an instant. I backed away silently, needing to escape before I confronted them with a rage that frightened even me. The irony did not escape me in that moment. I truly felt capable of the violence they had falsely attributed to my father for years. I drove aimlessly for hours, my knuckles white on the steering wheel as highways and exit signs blurred through tears of anger and shame. My entire identity had been constructed around a central lie, the narrative of an abusive father I needed to fear and reject. Memories replayed with new context. My father's bewildered expression when police officers led him from our home. His painful attempts to maintain a relationship despite my coldness. The letters I had discarded, unread. The school events he attended despite knowing he would be ignored. I pulled over at a rest stop, suddenly unable to breathe. Gripping the door of my car, I vomited into the gravel, my body physically rejecting the poison of deception I had unwittingly consumed for years. What kind of people would destroy a man simply because he was boring or lacked ambition? What kind of mother would turn her child against his father as insurance for her betrayal? As twilight descended, I realized I had been unconsciously driving toward the address on my father's last Christmas card, an apartment complex on the outskirts of Millfield, a modest building that had always reinforced my perception of his failure compared to Jackson's success. Now I understood it as evidence of what had been stolen from him. I turned the car around. Before I could face my father, I needed answers from the architects of this deception. Night had fallen by the time I returned to the sprawling house I had called home for 15 years. Lights blazed from every window, creating the illusion of warmth that I now recognized as wholly artificial. I found them in the kitchen, my mother chopping vegetables for dinner, while Jackson poured wine. The domestic scene, so normal, so practiced, fueled my anger. "I heard you talking in the office earlier," I said without preamble, my voice unnaturally calm. My mother's knife clattered against the cutting board. "Hector, we did not know you were coming home." Jackson recovered more quickly, his smile professional and practiced. "Great surprise, son. How long have you been here?" "Long enough to hear you toast to ruining my father's life." The words hung in the air between us. "Long enough to hear about the fake bruises and the lies you told in court?" My mother's face drained of color. "You misunderstood what you heard." "Did I misunderstand when you said Dad never raised a hand to you, that you made up the abuse, that you used me as your insurance policy?" Jackson set his wine glass down carefully. "You need to calm down and think about what you are doing here, what I am doing." My voice rose despite my efforts to control it. "What about what you two have been doing for 15 years? Lying to me, manipulating me, turning me against my own father. We gave you everything." Jackson countered, his facade of affection dissolving into cold calculation. "Look at the life you have had because of us: private schools, college without debt, connections that got you those job offers. At what cost? My relationship with my father, his reputation, his business." "Your father was weak," Jackson said dismissively. "In business and in life. Someone stronger was always going to take what he had." The casual cruelty stunned me into momentary silence. This was the true Jackson Turner, the man who had hidden behind the mask of concerned friend and devoted stepfather. My mother tried a different approach, tears welling in her eyes. "We may have made mistakes, but everything we did was to give you a better life. Do not," I warned, stepping back from her outstretched hand, "do not pretend this was for me. You wanted his friend, his money, his lifestyle. I was just collateral damage." "That is not true," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then tell me the truth now. All of it." For the next hour, I forced them to recount every lie, every manipulation, every moment of my childhood that had been poisoned by their deception. My mother eventually broke down completely, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the weight of exposed truth. Jackson remained coldly pragmatic, as if discussing a business transaction gone slightly awry. "What do you want now?" he finally asked. "Money. A better position in the company." I looked at this man who had posed as a father figure while systematically destroying my real father's life. "I want nothing from you. Not your money, not your name, not your connections." To my mother, I added, "And I want nothing from you until you make this right." I walked out of that house for what I knew would be the last time, leaving behind the material comforts that had been my consolation prize for unwittingly participating in their betrayal. The following day, I sat in a booth at Millfield Diner, anxiously checking my watch every few minutes. My father had sounded cautious on the phone, his voice revealing years of conditioned expectation of rejection. When he walked through the door, I barely recognized him. 15 years had turned his dark hair, mostly gray, added lines around his eyes, and slightly stooped his once straight shoulders. He still carried himself with quiet dignity, scanning the diner until our eyes met. For a long moment we just looked at each other across the room. The father who had lost everything but never stopped loving his son, and the son who had been manipulated into becoming an instrument of pain rather than comfort. I stood as he approached, unsure of the protocol for reuniting with someone you had wrongly rejected for most of your life. Should we shake hands? Was that too formal? Too impersonal? My father solved the dilemma by simply sitting across from me, his weathered hands folded on the table between us. "You look good," he said, his voice gentle. "College agreed with you." I could not meet his eyes, shame washing over me in waves. Dad, I. The word felt foreign on my tongue after years of reserving it for Jackson. "You do not have to explain," he said. "Whatever you needed to say was important enough for you to call. I am listening." The kindness in his voice broke something inside me. Tears came without warning, 15 years of misdirected anger and newfound shame colliding in a moment of raw vulnerability. They lied about everything I managed between shaky breaths. I heard them talking. "Mom admitted you never hurt her. They made it all up to take your business, your family. Me." My father sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I have waited a long time to hear those words," he said quietly. "Not for vindication, but because I knew someday you would need to know the truth. For your own peace. How can you be so calm? They destroyed your life. I helped them do it." He reached across the table hesitantly, as if expecting me to pull away. When I did not, he placed his hand over mine. "You were a child, Hector. Their victim as much as I was." In that moment, I understood the true measure of my father's character, not in his ability to build houses or provide material things, but in his capacity for forgiveness in the face of profound injustice. Over the next several hours, my father filled in the gaps of the story I had never known. How Jackson had systematically approached his construction clients with rumors about my father's instability. How the divorce settlement had drained his savings while fighting the false abuse allegations. How he had made the painful decision to step back rather than force me to testify in court. The court-appointed psychologist said continuing to fight would traumatize you further, he explained. I had to choose between clearing my name and protecting you from being pulled deeper into adult conflicts. He had downsized his company, rebuilding slowly with the few loyal employees who stood by him. Despite financial struggles, he had never missed a child support payment. I wanted you to know I would always provide for you, even if you believed the worst about me. Most painfully, I learned that my father had attended every significant event in my life. Every baseball game, every graduation, watching from a distance to avoid making me uncomfortable. I was there when you hit that home run in the state championship, he said with a small smile. Back row baseball cap pulled low. I was there when you graduated high school. Stood at the very back so you would not see me and be upset on your big day. The enormity of what had been stolen from us both left me breathless. 15 years of potential memories, conversations, guidance gone because two selfish people had decided their desires mattered more than a child's relationship with his father. I cannot get those years back for us, I said, voice breaking. I do not know how to make this right. My father's answer was simple. We start today. The past belongs to yesterday. In the weeks that followed my discovery, my mother's carefully constructed world began to crumble. Jackson, ever the pragmatist, had quickly distanced himself once the truth emerged, unwilling to deal with the emotional fallout, as he called it. Her calls and texts became increasingly desperate, switching between apologies, justifications, and guilt trips with dizzying frequency. Her doctor prescribed anxiety medication as she struggled to cope with the consequences of her exposed deception. "I need you, Hector," she pleaded during one call. "I am your mother. Family forgives." "You did not forgive Dad for the crime of being ordinary," I replied. "You punished him by taking away his son." "I was unhappy," she countered. "Does not that count for anything? So was I for 15 years. I just did not know why." When her mental health deteriorated further, she attempted to use it to manipulate my return. "The doctor says my condition is worsening. I might need hospitalization. Will that make you happy?" I established clear boundaries, despite the weight of guilt she attempted to place on me. "I will check on you weekly. I will make sure you have what you need. But I cannot be your emotional support while I am still processing what you did." The most healing decision I made was moving into an apartment just 10 minutes from my father's home. After declining the corporate job offers that Jackson's connections had secured, I joined my father's small construction company, learning the business from the ground up. My first day on site, the veteran workers watched me with skeptical eyes, wondering if I would demand special treatment as the boss's son. Instead, I showed up early, worked alongside them hauling lumber and mixing concrete, and stayed late helping my father with paperwork. "You have got soft hands," one worker named Marco joked. "We will fix that." Within weeks, calluses formed where blisters had been physical evidence of the more authentic life I was building. The satisfaction of creating something tangible, of seeing a project move from foundation to finished home, gave me a purpose I had never found in the corporate world Jackson had groomed me for. Evenings with my father were initially awkward, our conversations halting and unsure. We were in many ways strangers to each other, separated by years of manufactured distance. "I do not know your favorite food anymore," he admitted one night as we sat on his small balcony. "Lasagna," I told him. "Still lasagna, just like when I was 8. He smiled, a small victory in our careful rebuilding. We established new traditions: Sunday morning, fishing trips that echoed those from my childhood but with adult conversation, replacing the simple lessons of youth. We talked about everything and nothing: politics, sports, and eventually, the pain we had both carried. "I used to be so angry," my father confessed during one such trip. "Not at you, never at you, but at them." For years that anger ate away at me. "How did you let it go?" I asked, genuinely needing to know. "By focusing on what I could control, by believing someday the truth would matter, by refusing to become the man they accused me of being." His wisdom, earned through suffering I had unwittingly contributed to, humbled me deeply. The path to healing was neither quick nor straightforward. I established limited structured contact with my mother, meeting in public places where emotional manipulation had less power. I severed all ties with Jackson, returning the watch he had given me as a college graduation gift with a simple note bought with stolen time. My father's remarkable lack of bitterness became my blueprint for moving forward. Despite everything taken from him, his reputation, his business opportunities, his relationship with his only child, he had refused to become bitter. "Carrying hatred only poisons the carrier," he told me during a quiet evening in his workshop, where he was teaching me to build a rocking chair. I decided long ago not to give them that victory too. I have learned that forgiveness is not a single moment, but a daily choice. Some days I succeed. Others the anger resurfaces when I consider all that was stolen. But each day gets easier as I replace fabricated memories with authentic ones, helping my father expand his business, sharing meals in his modest apartment, creating the relationship we should have had all along. Life does not offer perfect resolutions. Some wounds leave permanent scars. But I have found peace in reclaiming my story and knowing that truth, however delayed, eventually finds its way to the surface. Have you ever discovered that something you believed about a family member was completely wrong? How did you rebuild your relationship afterward? Share your experience in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe, so others who have experienced family betrayals can find this community. Thank you for listening to my journey, and I wish you clarity and healing in your own family relationships.